Hello and welcome back. Now, it occurs to me that even though I did a video on what voodoo or voodoo is, I forgot to cover an important aspect or chapter of that, and that is Louisiana voodoo. And I'll be covering that here because Louisiana voodoo is the main force keeping voodoo alive in America today. Louisiana voodoo, also known as New Orleans voodoo, is an African diasporic religion which originated in Louisiana, now in the southern United States. It arose through a process of synchronism between the traditional religions of West Africa, the Roman Catholic form of Christianity, and Haitian voodoo. No central authority is in control of Louisiana voodoo, which is organized through autonomous groups. Historical records reveal the names of various deities who were worshipped in voodoo. Prominent among them were Blanc Dani, the Grand Zombie, and Papa Libat. These were venerated at altars where sacrifices were made to them. Spirits of the dead also played a prominent role in historical voodoo, with some contemporary practitioners regarding the religion as a form of ancestor worship. Historical accounts suggest that in the 19th century, the saints played a prominent role, although amid the 20th century revival, the veneration of deities from African diasporic religions became common. The production of charms, which are known as gris-gris, plays an important part. From the early 18th century enslaved West Africans, the majority of them, Bambara and Congo, were brought to the French colony of Louisiana. There, the traditional religions would have synchronized with the Roman Catholic beliefs of the French. This continued as Louisiana came under Spanish control and was then purchased by the United States in 1803. In the early 19th century, many migrants fleeing the Haitian Revolution arrived in Louisiana, bringing with them Haitian voodoo, which contributed to the formation of Louisiana voodoo. Although the religion was never banned, its practice was restricted through a range of laws regulating when and where black people could gather practice secretly. It spread up the Mississippi River to Missouri. During the 19th century, several prominent practitioners such as Mary Laveau and Dr. John attracted considerable attention by the early 20th century. The public practice of voodoo had heavily declined. After 1960, the New Orleans tourist industry increasingly used references to voodoo to attract visitors. While a voodoo revival took place, the practitioners of which often drew heavily on other African diasporic religions, such as Haitian voodoo and Cuban Santeria. Although originating among African diasporic communities in New Orleans, Louisiana, voodoo has included white participants since at least the 19th century, and some contemporary voodoo groups have a majority white membership. The religion has long faced opposition from the non-practitioners, who have characterized it as witchcraft and devil worship, and many sensationalist portrayals of the religion have featured in popular culture. Various academic sources describe Louisiana voodoo as a religion, as do some practitioners. More specifically, it has been characterized as an African Creole and an African American religion. Louisiana voodoo has also been referred to as New Orleans voodoo, and in some older texts, voodooism. The scholar Ina J. Fandrich described it as the Afro-Creole counterculture religion of southern Louisiana. It describes a religion that emerged along the banks of Mississippi River and especially in the city of New Orleans. Several spellings of voodoo have been used. Alternatives have included voodoo and vado. The spelling voodoo is sometimes used for Louisiana practice to distinguish it from Haitian voodoo. In some sources, practitioners are referred to as voodoos themselves, and elsewhere as voodooists. A related term is hoodoo, which may originally have been largely synonymous with voodoo. Over time, hoodoo came to describe the brand of African American supernaturalism found along the Mississippi, entailing the use of charms and spells that made little reference to deities. In this, it differs from the specific religion characterized by the term voodoo, and also used various herbs. There's more of a herbal aspect of that religion. Louisiana voodoo is a secretive religion. In 1972, for instance, the historian Blake Touchstone noted that Louisiana voodoo was then largely being practiced outside the public eye. Among some contemporary practitioners, there is a tradition not to speak to non-adherents about voodoo. Louisiana voodoo has not remained static, but has adapted and changed over time in its original form. It probably survived into the early 20th century. In the late 20th century, there was a revival of Louisiana voodoo, creating a tradition that more closely resembles the Haitian voodoo and the Cuban santeria than the 19th century Louisiana voodoo that is described in historical accounts. Some 21st century practitioners have also sought instruction from West African traditions, for instance being initiated into West African voodoo. Voodoo is a largely oral tradition. It has no formal creed, not a specific sacred text, and has no unifying organized structure or hierarchy. Practitioners will often adopt voodoo to suit their specific requirements, in doing so often mixing it with other religious traditions. Throughout its history, many voodoo practitioners have also practiced Roman Catholicism, while in the 21st century, voodoo practitioners have, for instance, combined voodoo with elements of Judaism and Kabbalah or with Hinduism. Louisiana voodoo has no formal theology, although it displays its own spiritual hierarchy. Writing in 2010, the voodoo practitioner and poet Brenda Maria Obspe described a belief in a somewhat distant but single deity being part of the religion, while Rory O'Neill Schmidt and Rosary Hartel O'Neill expressed the belief that contemporary voodoo was monotheistic. Many practitioners of voodoo have not seen their religion as being in intrinsic conflict with the Roman Catholicism that was along the Mississippi River. Louisiana voodoo also displayed a range of lesser deities, the names of which were recorded in various 19th century sources. One of the chief deities was Blanc Danny, also known as Monsieur Danny, voodoo magician and grandfather rattlesnake. He was depicted as a serpent and associated with discord and the defeat of enemies. Another recorded name, Dambara Soutons, may be an additional name for Blanc Danny. It is also possible that Blanc Danny was ultimately equated with another deity known as the Grand Zombie, whose name meant great god or great spirit. The term zombie derives from the Congo Bantu term Nzambi god. Another prominent deity was Papa Legbat, also called Liba, Libas, or Laba Limba, and he was seen as a trickster as well as a doorkeeper. He is the only one of these New Orleans deities with an unequivocally Yoruba origin. Monsieur Asunekwe, also known as Onzanekwe and Onsatia, was associated with good fortune, while Monsieur Aguso or Vot Auguso was associated with love. Variquet was a spirit associated with the causing of illness, while Monsieur de Arambas was linked to death. Carlo was a child deity. The names of several other deities are recorded, but with little known about their associations, including Jean Macubulamba, sorry if I can butcher that. He was also known as Columba, Maman Yo, and Yo Su. There was also a deity called Samonga, called upon by practitioners in Missouri when they were collecting mud. The Voodoo revival of the late 20th century has drawn many of its deities from Haitian Voodoo, where these deities are called Lawa. Among the Lawa commonly venerated are Ocean, Azuli Lad Flambo, Azuli Frida, Ogomara, and Papalegba. These can be divided into separate nonch or nations such as Rada and the Petwa. Glasman's New Orleans temple, for example, has separate altars to the Rada and Petwo Loa. Each of these is associated with particular items, colours, numbers, and foodstuff and drinks. They are often considered to be intermediaries of God, who in Haitian Voodoo is usually termed Le Bon Dieu. The spirits of the dead played a prominent role in Louisiana Voodoo during the 19th century. The prominence of the spirits of the dead may owe something to the fact that New Orleans' African American population was heavily descended from enslaved Congolese, whose traditional religions placed emphasis on such spirits. In the 21st century, Louisiana Voodoo has been characterized as a system of ancestor worship. Communicating with the ancestors is an important part of its practice, with these ancestral spirits often invoked during ceremonies. As Africans arrived in Louisiana, they adopted from Roman Catholicism, and so various West African deities became associated with specific Roman Catholic saints. Interviews with elderly New Orleans conducted in 1930s and 1940s suggested, as it existed in the closing 3 decades of the 19th century, Voodoo primarily entailed supplications to the saints for assistance. Among the most popular was Saint Anthony of Padua. This figure is also the patron saint of the Congo, likely linked to the heavily Congo-descended population of New Orleans. Rejecting the centrality of the saints for her 20th century practice, Obse has described these saints as servants and messengers of the ancestors. She related that unlike the Haitian Voodoo and the Cuban Santeria, the Roman Catholic saints retained their distinct identities rather than being equated with specific West African deities. In early 21st century form, Louisiana Voodoo accords particular respect to elders. Various commentators have described Louisiana Voodoo as matriarchal because of the dominant role of the priestess or voodoo queen have played in it. Also, they describe the religion as being entirely within the sphere of women, whom we call mothers. The feminist theorist Tara Green defined the term voodoo feminism to describe instances whereby African American women drew upon both Louisiana voodoo and conjure to resist racial and gender oppression that they experienced. Michelle Gordon believed that the fact that 3 women of colour dominated voodoo in the 19th century represented a direct threat to the ideological foundations of the white supremacy and patriarchy. As for its full history, much mystery surrounds the origins of Louisiana voodoo, with its history often being embellished with legend. French settlers arrived in Louisiana in 1699, with the first enslaved Africans being brought to the colony in 1719. In 1763, the Spanish Empire took control and remained in power until 1803. The religions of the West African slaves combined with elements of the folk Catholicism practiced by the dominant French and Spanish colonialists to provide the origins of Louisiana voodoo. Under the French and Spanish colonial governments, voodoo did not experience strong persecution. There are no records of the Roman Catholic Church waging anti-superstition campaigns against the religion in Louisiana. All of the West African groups contributed to the development of Louisiana voodoo. Their knowledge of herbs, poisons, and the ritual creation of charms and amulets intended to protect oneself or harm others became key elements of Louisiana voodoo. During the French colonial period, around 80% of the enslaved Africans brought to Louisiana were from the Bambara people of the Senegal River Basin. Most of the other 20% were Congolese, with a few from Dahomey. After the Spanish took control, increasing numbers of slaves were imported from the Congo, ensuring a Congolization of New Orleans, African American community. The enslaved community quickly outnumbered white European colonists who emigrated there. The French colony was not a stable society when the enslaved sub-Saharan Africans arrived, and the newly arrived sub-Saharan Africans dominated the slave community. According to a census of 1731-1732, the ratio of enslaved sub-Saharan Africans to European settlers was more than 2 to 1. A relatively small number of colonists were planters and slaveholders, owners of sugar plantations with work that required large labour forces. Because the Africans were held in large groups relatively isolated from interaction with whites, their preservation of African indigenous practices and culture was enabled. In northern Louisiana and other European colonies in the American South, enslaved families were usually divided. Large numbers of African slaves who were once closely related by family or community were sent to different plantations. However, in southern Louisiana, families, cultures, and languages were kept more intact than in the north. This allowed the cultural traditions, languages, and religious practices of the enslaved to continue there. Under the French Code and the influence of Catholicism, officials normally recognized the families groups prohibiting the sale of slave children away from their families if younger than age of 14. They promoted the man-made legend of Wake Tuco of the enslaved population. The high mortality of the slave trade brought its survivors together with a sense of solidarity and initiation. The absence of fragmentation in the enslaved community, along with the kinship system produced by the bond created by the difficulties of slavery, resulted in a coherent, functional, well-integrated, autonomous, and self-confident enslaved community. The practice of making and wearing charms and amulets for protection, healing, or the harm of others was a key aspect to early Louisiana voodoo. The Ouanga, a charm used to poison an enemy, contained the toxic roots of the figure mandate tree brought from Africa and preserved in Louisiana. The ground-up root was combined with other elements such as bones, nails, roots, holy water, holy candles, holy incense, holy bread, or crucifixes. This administrator of the ritual frequently invoked protection from Jehovah and Jesus Christ. This openness of Western belief allowed for the adoption of Catholic practices into Louisiana voodoo. Another element brought from West Africa was the veneration of ancestors and the subsequent emphasis on the respect for elders. For this reason, the rate of survival among elderly enslaved peoples was high, further Africanizing Louisiana Creole culture. Records of African traditional religious practices being practiced in Louisiana go back to the 1730s, when Anton Simon Lepage du Praz wrote about the use of gris-gris. In 1803, the United States took control of Louisiana through the Louisiana Purchase. This was roughly contemporary with the Haitian Revolution, whereby African-descended populations in the French Caribbean colony of Saint Domingue overthrew the French colonial government and established an independent republic, Haiti. Many of those fleeing the Revolutionary War fled to Louisiana, bringing with them Haitian Voodoo, a religion deriving from the synchronism of Fon and Yoruba traditional religions with Roman Catholicism. The migration was substantial. In 1809, alone 10,000 people arrived from Saint Domingo, doubling New Orleans' population. These migrants converted various native-born Louisiana blacks to their religion, with their practices fusing with the African-derived religious traditions already present in Louisiana, contributing to the formation of Louisiana voodoo. According to legend, the first meeting place of voodoo practitioners in New Orleans was at an abandoned brickyard in Domain Street. These meetings here faced police disruption, and so future meetings took place largely in Bayou St. John, and along the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. The religion probably appealed to members of the African diaspora, whether enslaved or free, who lacked recourse to retribution for the poor treatment they received through other means. Voodoo probably spread out from Louisiana and into African American communities throughout the Mississippi River Valley, as there are 19th century references to voodoo rituals in both St. Louis and St. Joseph in Missouri. Voodoo was never explicitly banned in Louisiana. However, amid establishment fears that voodoo may be used to foment a slave rebellion, in 1817, the municipal issued an ordinance preventing slaves from dancing on days other than on Sundays and in locations other than those specifically designated for that purpose. The main location permitted was New Orleans Congo Square. Voodoo dance rituals nevertheless continued clandestinely at other locations in the early part of the 19th century. Newspaper articles began denouncing the religion. In August 1850, about 50 women, several of whom were white, were arrested at a voodoo dance ceremony. They were subsequently fined. In 1855, a mob attempted to seize a practitioner, Elizabeth Sutherland, who they accused of putting spells on people. The local police gave her shelter at the station. During the American Civil War, the Union Army occupied New Orleans and sought to suppress voodoo. In 1863, 40 women were arrested at a voodoo dance ceremony in Mariez Street. Repression of voodoo intensified following the Civil War. The 1870s onward saw white writers display an increased concern that voodoo rituals were facilitating the interaction between black men and white women. That decade saw large gatherings at Lake Pontchartrain on St. John's Eve. Sorry, I butchered that. Including many onlookers and reporters. These declined after 1876 in the 1880s and 1890s. The New Orleans authorities again damped down on voodoo. Voodoo was used as evidence to bolster the white elite's claim that Africans were inferior to Europeans, and thus bolster their belief in the necessity of legalized segregation. Various practitioners set up shops selling paraphernalia and charms. They also began exploiting the commercial opportunities of the religion by staging ceremonies which charged entry. Free women of color dominated the leadership of voodoo in New Orleans. During the 19th century, they made a living through the selling and administering of amulets or gris-gris charms and magical powers, as well as spells and charms that guaranteed to cure ailments, grant desires, and confound or destroy one's enemies. As in other French colonial communities, a class of free people of colour developed who were given specific rights, and in New Orleans acquired property and education. Free women of colour had a relatively high amount of influence, particularly those who were spiritual leaders. Among the 15 voodoo queens in neighbourhoods scattered around